Right. So now that we know a little bit about Confucius's background and context, let's dive into books one and two of the Analects. What I'll do is I will start at the beginning and I'll read through the first few sayings here, the first few sections, and then I'll skip around a little bit and just highlight some other sections from books one and two. And along the way, I will be pulling out some themes and some concepts that we want to focus on as most important for our purposes in understanding Confucius. So the entire Analects begins as follows. The master said, "To study and at due times practice what one has studied, is this not a pleasure? When friends come from distant places, is this not a joy? To remain unsoured when his talents are unrecognized, is this not a junsa?" So the first sentence is emphasizing something that is repeatedly emphasized in the Confucian tradition, which is the importance of studying and self-cultivation. The idea here basically is it's good to be someone who wants to improve one's skills. It's good to try to learn, to study hard, to try to know more, and to be better at what one does. So that's a theme that comes up again and again, and it's almost a part of everything else that Confucius says and thinks about the way that we should live. He describes a particularly good person, a particularly ethical person, as one who is always studying and learning. And so this high valuation of being someone who tries to do better, tries to cultivate themselves to become a better person and to know more and to do better is a key part of Confucius's ideal for how we should live. The second sentence is a nice comment about friends, but it also tells us something about Confucius himself, as does the first sentence. The first sentence tells us that Confucius himself liked learning. He enjoyed learning and improving his skills. The second tells us as well that he did have friends come and visit him from afar, particularly later in his life when he was a kind of exiled, wise person, no longer in a particular political post. People would visit him just because they had heard of his wisdom, or because they were old friends of his, or they had had political associations or affiliations previously. So this idea of people coming to visit from distant places, he's kind of describing, this is the way this is often read, this in an introductory passage, as Confucius describing what's good about his life as a kind of independent, wandering intellectual, that people will come to him, and he's connected to the whole world in a way because of his status as one who is a wise person. And the last sentence is important as well, particularly because it introduces the concept of the junsa. So a junsa is a kind of gentleman or a good person. It's basically Confucius's word for the person who behaves in an admirable, ideal way. It's his word for the person who is qualified to be a leader of others, to be a good advisor or a good political leader. Okay, so it's someone who exhibits all of the different traits, that he emphasizes and speaks about the goodness of throughout the Analects. So being someone who enjoys studying and is constantly studying, that would be a characteristic of a junsa. Being someone, as we'll see, who's trustworthy and loyal and attentive to their affairs, these are characteristics of a junsa. But notice that people can be good. They can have lots of good characteristics, but the junsa is a kind of like highest ideal. It's the best that a person can be as a junsa. And so a little later we'll see he says other things like the junsa is not a vessel, by which he means the junzi is not just a tool. A junzi is not someone who's good at fulfilling only one function. Their powers are more expansive than that. So they're not just a specialist that they just do one thing. They're someone who has a broader perspective on what the world is about and what's valuable and what needs doing and how to do it. And so they're better at being a leader because they have this broader perspective. Sure, maybe they have specific skills, they can do lots of specific things, but they're not completely aligned with just doing one specific thing, which would make them like a vessel, that is like a kind of like a pot, right? What's a vessel? Something that holds something. They're not just a tool like that. They have a more expansive way of approaching the world and solving problems. And here, when Confucius says to remain unsoured when his talents are unrecognized, is this not a junzi? People have said he may be referring to himself, though he probably was also counseling his students. The idea here is, even if the world doesn't recognize how much you can do, how reasonable your opinion is, how you have a better policy or idea about how to handle a problem than the kind of everyday person does or than the world does. You know, you might think in today's climate where there are people taking very extreme positions about all kinds of things, and you know, think about, like, for instance, flat earthers or something, right? So there are people taking all kinds of crazy positions out there, and imagine that through some peculiar quirk of history, the entire US government got into the hands of flat earthers and they were in control and they were, you know, persecuting non-flat earthers. Well, that would be horrible, and all of the scientific community would find it difficult to know how to go on, surely. But the Confucian lesson would be, as an individual, it's not good to be resentful at the world for not appreciating the fact that you know better how things are. And so his ideal person that he's describing here is someone kind of like himself in this situation where their talents are not recognized, because he, again, had lost his political post. And so the question is, you know, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to be resentful about that the world doesn't recognize how good of a job you could do in steering the social order and steering the well-being of groups of people? Or are you going to remain unsoured, that is, not become resentful, but just do the best you can with the circumstances as they are? And so that Confucius is saying here, I mean, I may be reading a little bit too much into this, but this is one reading that has been given of this first passage from the book, that part of what he's saying is it's best to be like me in the sense of not becoming resentful at a world that doesn't appreciate you, but rather just keep focusing on developing your talents and your knowledge, and do the best you can in whatever situation you're in or whatever situation the world throws at you. Okay, so this video is already getting a bit long. I'm going to pause here, and then I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through the rest of Analect's books 1 and 2.